15 books, among them Caring, A Feminine Approach to Ethics and Moral Education, and The Challenge in Care in Schools. This event is free. However, we'd ask that you contact City Club to make a reservation so we'll know how many people to expect. It's from 5:30 to 7 o'clock on January 24th. And you are invited to a party. 2 weeks from today, Friday the 26th, we'll have the final Friday open house at City Club between 4:30 and 6 o'clock. And members and guests are invited to drop by City Club Commons, share refreshments and conversation. Hope to see you there. Citizens Read will meet on the evening of Monday, January 29th. The selection this month is Greg Mortensen and David Oliver Rellin's book, 3 Cups of Tea, One Man's Mission to Fight Terrorism and Build Nations, One School at a Time. We do have 2 new members of City Club here today, and I'd like you to stand and be welcomed by our membership. So please hold your applause till I've said the second name. They are Paul Kissling and Stacy Paley. Could you please stand? Welcome to City Club. We are so fortunate in Portland to have great corporate citizens that help make these programs possible. Our sponsors this quarter are Girding Eadlin Development Company, LLC, and McEwen Gisvold, LLP. Could you please join me in thanking them? It's no secret that here in Oregon, there has been a loss of confidence, respect, and credibility in our legislature. While we're fortunate that there are great citizens who are still willing to serve, many are discouraged from considering legislative service because of the cost of running, the low pay, the excessive and divisive partisanship, and a perceived inability to make a difference. The good news is that we are beyond denial, that both parties recognize that we have a problem and that we're working on a fix. Shortly before adjourning in August of 2005, through the joint leadership of Senate President Peter Courtney and House Speaker Karen Minnis, a law was passed that established the Public Commission on Oregon Legislature. If you fast forward 18 months, we now have a bold report and proposed legislation that would create substantial changes in the Oregon Legislature. Our speaker today is one of the co-chairs of the commission. I'd like to introduce Gary Wilhelms. Gary has seen the Oregon Legislature from nearly every angle during the last 35 years. He served in the Oregon House of Representatives 4 terms beginning in 1972, representing the 53rd District in Klamath County. And believe it or not, Gary received the nomination of both the Republican and Democratic parties in 1976 and 1978. Imagine that happening today. In 1979, he served as the House Minority Leader. And in 1987, Gary was employed by the Oregon Senate President Brady Adams as Special Assistant to the Senate President. He subsequently served as Chief of Staff to then Speaker of the House, Lynn Snodgrass, and later Gary returned to work at the Oregon Legislature as Chief of Staff for the House Majority Leader, Karen Minnis, where he continued in that role for the last 2 sessions. Gary and his wife have 4 children, 4 grandchildren, and they now reside in the Bethany area of Washington County. Our other scheduled speaker for today wasn't able to be here. Her name is Judge Laura Pryor. She's the only member, and she was a co-chair, of the Public Commission on the Oregon Legislature. She was the only one from east of the mountains. And as it turns out, the road between Condon and I-84 is just too icy for travel, so she couldn't be here today. She is an extraordinary citizen and public servant. The commission, however, is well represented by Gary Wilhelms. Following Gary's presentation, There will be plenty of time for questions. He invites you to ask provocative and probing questions about the work of the Commission and the Legislature. I'd like to present Gary Wilhelms.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to further publicize the activities and the recommendations of your Public Commission on the Oregon Legislature. As you know, I was to have been sharing the podium today with the other co-chair of the Commission, Judge Laura Pryor from Gilliam County, but she unfortunately is a victim of the weather, and we didn't know that until about 9 o'clock last night. Let me go through setting the stage for the Public Commission on the Legislature and why it was created and how it was organized and so forth, and then we can get into the recommendations in the final report, especially now that I have an extra 15 minutes, I understand. Why a Public Commission on the Legislature? In the introductory remarks, you heard what we heard repeatedly. There was a negative public perception, all of a sudden, of the legislature. There was a loss of public confidence in the legislature's ability to get its work done. There was a reduction of legislative influence because of increased influence of agencies, the feds, the lobby, initiatives, and so forth. And there was a desire to restore the legislative branch of government as an equal branch with the executive branch and the judicial branch. Also, we faced increasing complexity of state funding obligations that resulted from ballot measures 5, 11, and 37. Some of them are almost old history now, but still the fact remains that the shift in the responsibility of funding from local government to state government has had a significant effect on the ability of the state legislature to meet its obligations in state budgeting. There is, of course, the perception of excessive partisanship, and we can delve into that later if you wish. There was huge escalation in the cost of political campaigns at the legislative level, and most of you know by now that we broke the $1 million mark for one House race, one side of one House race, this last election. So that is a concern, and it's fact. The decline of the citizen legislature, that is the difficulty to serve as a citizen in the legislature because of the costs of the campaigns, you have to raise the money, because many people just will not subject themselves personally or their families to the brutal local campaigns that we have today in today's political environment. And then we also need to take a look every 3 or 4 decades, I suppose, to bring our institution into whatever century we happen to be in with regard to technology and so forth. And we are lagging on some of the technology in the state legislature, although you'll be pleased to know, and I'll talk about it some more as we get into it, some of the steps we've made to bring us literally into the 21st century with technology, communication, staffing, budgeting, redistricting, and so forth. And then finally, maybe now more than back when we did this 30 years ago, there's a little more concern about security in the Capitol building and for the legislature, safety, space requirements, obviously, and the maintenance and modernization of the infrastructure of the state capitol complex itself. So how did we go about dealing with these problems? The presiding officers, Senate President Peter Courtney and Speaker of the House Karen Minnis, made a decision early that they wanted to do something, and they began discussion about doing something similar to what was done the last time in 1974. And as a Chief of Staff for the Speaker, I sat in the meetings with the Chief of Staff for the Senate President and the 2 presiding officers over the discussions on these things. And as a person who got to deal with some of those recommendations while serving in the legislature, it was of great interest to me. So I stuck my hand up and said, well, if you're looking for a chair along the way, I volunteer. And the Senate President said, wisely, maybe co-chair. And so that's the way it ended up. We went ahead, and in order to be politically correct these days, you do not appoint small committees very often. especially a public commission like this. So we ended up with 30 members. And I was holding my head thinking, oh man, 30 members. Well, it ends up, it was good. It was a good exercise, and the 30 people functioned well, and we got along good together, and were able to produce, I think, a very good final report, especially after the first meeting, which was a little bit chaotic. But the Senate President and the Speaker of the House both had to agree on all 30 members. It wasn't you get 15 and I get 15. They had to both nod yes for all 30. So that helped, because there was a bond when we first started meeting. And then finally the legislature passed a bill that codified the whole thing. Senate Bill 1084 in the 2005 session actually established the commission and gave us a budget, which was a good thing, and just made it just formalized it, and so it removed any question about it. So we went ahead, and then we had our first meeting in September, after the session had adjourned. The intent of the leaders that is the co-chairs of the Public Commission, Laura and I, was that we we have a blue sky atmosphere to receive suggestions from anybody and everybody, and we would take any suggestion regardless of what we might have personally thought about it or where it came from or anything else. And then we would, after we received all those suggestions, we would divide them up, and we would kind of operate like a mini legislature. So we created 5 committees of 6 members each, and we referred all the suggestions. There were some 220 plus suggestions, and we referred them all into committees, and the committees deliberated on the recommendations and then gave their recommendations back to the commission, and then the full commission would adopt or reject or modify or send back to committee or whatever the recommendations that came out of committee. And we tried our best to deal with every one of the 224 plus recommendations that we had, because we felt that if someone took the time to make the recommendation, we ought to at least take the time to consider it. So we did in all but a few cases. And we did make recommendations that went like, we have no further recommendation on this matter. We believe that we ought to cease discussion of this matter. Some people even said, this matter is not a good idea. We're not going to discuss it any further. And those recommendations were, in fact, brought back to the full commission, and the commission got to adopt those negative recommendations as well. But we did, I think, deal with just about every one of them. The commission was supposed to provide study and analysis, which they did. The committees, depending upon the recommendations, some of them are slam dunks and some of them are really complicated. And so there was a lot more research done on some than on others, but we had available to us a lot of local and national experts, and we worked through the National Conference of State Legislatures and the Council of State Governments and other bodies to get information when we didn't have the local expertise that we thought we needed. And we called and actually visited other states to a limited extent to see how they dealt with the things that we knew that they had already dealt with that we were trying to deal with. So we reached out way beyond just the 30 members of the local commission. One of the objectives that we have, and I see formerly Honorable Jane Cease in the audience today, former Senator Jane Cease, who was on the commission and a good commission member. And the first time I used the word, we want to give the legislature some political cover, she took my head off in the meeting. She didn't like the use of the phrase giving the legislature political cover very much. So I've changed my pitch, Jane. What we want to do is provide third-party support for the legislature. And so we do believe that it's good for the legislature, when you're talking about a lot of inside baseball, let's face it, it's good when an outside group can be supportive of what the insiders are trying to do to themselves. Otherwise, they get enough criticism as it is, and some of it's deserved and some of it's not. But it's very good to have a place where they can deflect some of these things. And some of the recommendations that they're dealing with today, as we speak, came from the Public Commission, and they're being criticized openly on the air by some of your favorite talk show hosts. And it's very nice to be able to say, hey, look, go talk to the Public Commission on the Legislature. They're the ones that introduced this bill. They're the ones that brought this idea forth. There are 30 members there that represent a broad range of interests, not just us here in the legislature that are doing this. And I believe that's valuable. I think it is. Now, whether Lars Larson listens to it or not, I don't know. You know that, as I said, the structure was 30 members, 2 co-chairs, 5 committees of 6. 2 of those committees were merged about halfway through our deliberations. The Management Committee and the Human Resources Committee were merged into one because the items that they were dealing with were really kind of merged and kind of worked together. Over 200 suggestions. After we condensed them down to all of the like suggestions being grouped, we ended up still with over 140 suggestions, separate suggestions. The work was all done in committee. Final report was made to the Emergency Board on December 1st, as scheduled, on time, and under budget. Now, this has been a great exercise, and I believe all the members of the Commission gained a lot, and I certainly know that I did. I've always been kind of a snob, if you will, when it comes to the Oregon Legislature. I've never been very interested in imposing other states' methods on our state. It has been a revelation to discover that there are some ideas out there that are just as good as ours. And frankly, many states have already dealt with the very problems that we're dealing with today in the Oregon Legislature. States as far away as Washington to the north have already dealt with these things. So it was good to go up there and talk to them and see what they did to take care of these problems that we didn't know anybody else had solved. So anyway, it was a good growth experience for all of us, especially me. Simply stated, I believe that the charge from the Senate President and the Speaker, and ultimately from the entire legislature, was to look for ways to improve the efficiency of the legislature and its image. Some of the Commission's recommendations are innovative and outside the box, but we believe that they are respectful of the tradition of the Oregon Legislature. They are not made with disrespect for the current structure and the current processes, but rather to improve them. You will find that a number of the recommendations are integrated. That is, they should be implemented in conjunction with other recommendations made by the Commission. They are not intended to stand alone. Standing alone, they might be a little politically sensitive, but coupled with others, they might be good, and I'll give you, we can explore an example of that later, but the tie between legislative compensation and an increase in legislative compensation, and how you can spend your surplus campaign funds, the recommendations that we made tied the recommendations on those 2 items together because they are both very politically charged and highly sensitive issues in the media especially. Obviously, we do not have the time today to go through the recommendations contained in the final report in the detail necessary to do them all justice. If any of you have a keen interest in our legislature, I encourage you to obtain a copy and read through the final report, and I only brought 4 copies today, but there are more available, obviously, and if you really want to dig in, why, we can provide you with a copy of the final report and would be happy to do so. I think you will find the report interesting and thought-provoking, and in the meantime, please be aggressive during questions and answers today so that we can explore some of these things in more detail, because I'm going to go through them fairly rapidly. We on the Commission know that some of the recommendations will be implemented and some will not. Some will be amended and improved through legislative deliberation, and that's good. Co-Chair Pryor and I plan to advocate for the Commission recommendations all through the 2007 session when called, and I thought, nah, that's not going to happen very often. The legislature is going to do what they're going to do. Well, they called earlier this week, and I get to go testify this afternoon at 4 o'clock before the House Committee. And they called again later this week, and I get to go testify next Tuesday before the Senate Committee. So I guess they are going to do that, and I appreciate that. I know that Laura is going to try to be there next Tuesday as well, so we're looking forward to that. We recommended that the legislature appoint a single joint committee to receive and work the Commission recommendations. I'm not sure yet whether they're going to be able to accommodate that request. It doesn't look like it, but that's a very complicated matter in appointing special joint committees. But if they don't, that's okay. We will just deal with the committee structure that we have, and we'll work individually with whichever committee it is that's going to deal with our bills. Many of the recommendations will also require Ways and Means Committee review, since they will require the investment of resources, and in some cases, substantial resources. In those cases, I believe that we, on the Commission, can give convincing arguments, to defend our recommendations. If we cannot, then obviously the legislature is not going to move positively on them. And some of them are important. They're important in my heart as well as important to the Commission, because they deal with things that are politically sensitive, that need to be done, but it's going to be really difficult politically for the legislature to move on some of them. And we're going to stand in there and slug it out on these things, and I'm talking specifically about raising legislator compensation and remodeling the Capitol wings, the Capitol building, and the whole Capitol complex. And when we talk about that, we break the $100 million mark. We're not talking about peanuts. We're talking about spending a lot of money. But we can talk about this a little bit later. But it's very important that we start to move on this with prices going up the way they are. You will never get it done for less. And things are falling apart down there, and the price tag is going up. It's not a good situation. Allow me now to briefly review some of the more visible and important recommendations. And once again, pick your favorite, and you can explore it under questions and answers. The one that's been getting the most publicity recently is we call it retiming, but it's retiming / annual sessions. Obviously, we dwell on the annual session piece of that. The underpinning of this recommendation is an idea that we stole from our state to the north and many other states in the country that do it. And I think it's a wonderful thing. As the chief of staff for a presiding officer, it was my duty to each session write the memorandum that said, here are the dates. Now remember these dates, ladies and gentlemen, the folks in the legislature. This is the last day you can ask for your bills to be drafted, and this is the last day you can introduce them. And this is the day when the bills ought to move from one house to the other, and this is the day when we're going to shut down the committees, and we're aiming for this day out here, which at sine die. Now, I don't know how many of those memorandums I wrote and rewrote and amended and rewrote and extended, and which means that they didn't mean anything to anybody except me and maybe the presiding officer. We, as a result, never had a fixed date for any of these important occurrences in the legislature to manage to. Well, we found out that these other states did. And what they did was they passed a resolution up front, like the first week of the session, establishing these dates. And all the members vote on them and establish them, and then they stick to them. And when it says the committees are going to close down April 30th or May 30th or whatever date it is, they shut them down, and if your bill's not out, it's dead, and that's it. There's no more discussion, it's over. And you just move on towards sine die. And I think that's a good way to manage the legislative process. The legislature is now in the process of passing SCR 1, which is that resolution for the state of Oregon. Now, there are a couple of little out clauses in it, but it sets those dates, and it's going to allow the legislative leadership to manage those dates, and I would expect that we will adjourn by June 30th this year. That's my prediction. If not, it'll be a lot earlier, and that we certainly have fixed dates to manage to, and I believe that that's going to help the staff and the leadership, committee chairs, everybody else. And if it ultimately results in a June 30th sine die date, it's going to save the taxpayers a bunch of money, which they can turn around and spend on the annual session that this proposal suggests for the even year. The resolution puts about a 30-day limit. It's not even 30 days, it's less than that, but it's basically the month of February in '08, where there would be a try it and see if you like it annual session. Now, we've come under some criticism for that. Some people have called it a sneaky way to get annual sessions. Others have said it wasn't near direct enough. We should have passed a constitutional amendment. Well, ultimately, to require annual sessions, you do need to pass a constitutional amendment. But the fact is, in Oregon today, we can have an annual session under our current law and our current rules without touching the Constitution, because the members of the legislature can ballot themselves into a special session. And they have put a limitation on that special session with this resolution that they're passing, that it will not last more than 30 days. And it is intended to, if it is called, if they ballot themselves in next year, it will be only to deal with important, emergency if you will, but important policy matters and important budget matters, and that's it. There will be some sort of a screening mechanism put on the front end of that special session that will prevent, you know, everybody's favorite bill from showing up in the special session. It's not what it's for. That's not what it'll be used for. So that is probably the one that's getting the most publicity, and it's a fairly complicated change. It causes a little angst amongst the legislators, but it is unfolding as we speak. We recommended improved staffing. We recommended to try to professionalize our committee staff structure, if you will, make a career path available to people so we can hang on to our subject matter experts, keep them in-house. Legislators come and go, staffers come and go, but it's nice if we could have some place where there's some stability in the issues from year to year and session to session, because many of the issues remain in the forefront, but the basics change, and we need that continuity to help the legislators in their deliberations. So we recommended a professionalizing of that staff. We want to beef up the staff in the Legislative Revenue Office, Legislative Fiscal Office, and Legislative Council. We've already started that. Legislative Council has got more right now. We recommend one full-time staff person for each legislator year-round, both years of their term, as opposed to that which we do now, which is convoluted and gives them something less than that. But we think we've reached the point where they can use a staffer year-round, at least a budget for the staffer. If they don't want to hire a full-time staff, it's their call. And then we dealt with the hiring of family members. This is the second time I got my head handed to me. I said, nepotism, we decided in the commission that nepotism's okay. And some folks didn't like that particular way to put this. So now I say, nepotism's not okay, but hiring family members is. Now, the reason for that, we did put some restrictions on it. Now, let me tell you, hiring of family members is a very sensitive issue. When I served in the legislature, my wife was a very, very competent secretary, and who could better be my secretary in the legislature from a district 300 miles away than somebody from that district. And besides, we moved our family up, and so it all just fit nicely, and it helped pay the bills and everything else. And so I am an absolute defender of hiring family members for the right reason. What we did in the commission was make a recommendation, which I believe has been adopted now by rule, and that is that you need to file the salary level that you pay that family member with either the Secretary of the Senate or the Chief Clerk of the House, who then makes sure that that salary level falls within the accepted salary guidelines in the state employment structure. And you need to do the same thing if you give them a raise ever. And the reason, well, the basic reason for it is to cut off the ability of a legislator to, if you will, empty their account. When they know they're going to leave the legislature for whatever the reason, they can all of a sudden give the family member a raise unlimited and just empty their staff account. Well, you can't do that anymore. You're not going to be able to pay them any more than the normal, and you're not going to be able to empty your account. And that's where the abuses came. That's where the bad publicity came from in the process. So I think that's a good accomplishment that we've made. Improved compensation for the legislators. We're talking about staff, we're talking about salaries, we're talking about expense treatment, and we're talking about per diem, and we're talking about benefits and benefit levels. There's a lot of misinformation out there. The commission decided generally that legislators were undercompensated and that was having an effect on the ability of some good people to serve in the process. So, well, here's what we did. We recommended that you take an existing organization that exists called the Public Officials Compensation Commission, which has been largely ignored for the last decade, probably. They just haven't been given anything to do, but that we breathe new life into that organization, pass a law, pass a bill that amends the laws that guide that organization, and then give this question to them and let them make the decisions on how not just legislators, but all public officials in the state government should be compensated, and make their recommendations back to the legislature. The legislature is ultimately going to have to vote on the appropriation that sends the money out. But this way, I think it would gain a lot more public acceptance. And frankly, we heard from a lot of people that they thought legislators were not compensated adequately. And usually it's not the paycheck that gets any legislator in trouble. It's possibly how they use their per diem or how they use their surplus campaign funds and so forth, and how they mix them together, and that's what gets some people in trouble, at least in the media. And so we think that this is a good approach to the legislator compensation side of this puzzle. Then we moved to campaign finance reform, and once again we suggested, well, it seems to work if you get the right people to create a commission to really dig into the issue and come back with formal recommendations. So we recommended the creation of a commission if the legislature thinks that's necessary. Otherwise, we believe very strongly that we should restrict the use of surplus campaign funds, and you could say basically to expenses involved with campaigning for public office, and not being able to convert it to paying staff, which you can do today, to leasing an automobile, which you can do today, to paying the rent on your facility that you live in when you're in Salem, which you can do today, to pay other expenses involved with serving in the legislature. That's probably not why the money was contributed to your campaign, and probably should not therefore be used for that. But you can hardly blame a legislator if they've moved here from 300 miles away and had to set up housekeeping, and they cannot pay the bills without dipping into their surplus campaign funds. So we're saying pay the right amount and establish the right rules around per diem and so forth, and then restrict the use of the surplus campaign funds. Oh, and another surplus campaign fund restriction that we're strongly recommending, and I think that the Oregon Law Commission did as well, was to stop the pass-through of money through your campaign account, which means basically that if I as a candidate receive a contribution from person A, that I cannot turn around and give any money out of my campaign fund to another candidate, thus passing that contribution through to another candidate. There's a lot of that goes on today. It's totally legal in Oregon. There's a lot of it that goes on, and it has gotten the legislature, I think, into some trouble at times with their image. Ethics, we didn't deal a lot with the question of ethics other than the pay and the campaign contribution thing, but we said, whether you like the Oregon Government Standards and Practices Commission or not, they exist and we're not going to repeal it. Thus, they should be funded to a level where they can do their job. So we recommended full funding, and if it meant coming up with a new funding mechanism, that we come up with that. And that is under consideration as we speak. I see that we're almost to questions and answers, so I'm going to very quickly go through the rest of these, and you can pursue them during questions and answers. Improve public access. We recommended the establishment of an Oregon channel, which is up and running. I watched it myself, and if you really don't have anything to do while the legislature's in session and you want to watch the legislature on color television, have at it. You can also watch the Supreme Court and some hearings in the executive branch. We recommended more timely, geographically sensitive, and comprehensive public notice regarding hearings and work sessions of our committees, and that's being done. We recommended state capital improvements, including the establishment of a wireless network inside of the building so that you can bring your laptop into the building and use it. Now you can, that's up and running. We recommended increased security. That's up to the certified smart people in security, but there are a number of things that need to be done in the building and are underway. Wings and building renovation and space allocation is something that's a separate speech. I'll talk about it if you want to ask me questions. I hope you do. We also recommended the movement to an open primary structure, not necessarily the one that was going to be on the ballot last year, but we recommend that we should move to an open primary structure of some sort, that we should bifurcate the responsibilities of the Secretary of State's office and take those that are the political side, the election side, and put them into an office of state controller, which would be a nonpartisan elected office as separate from the Secretary of State, to try to departisanize that, the oversight of those functions. We also recommended moving the primary election date to a date later than May, not necessarily September, but later in the year. We recommended redistricting commission as opposed to the way we do it today, a audit office in the legislative fiscal organization to evaluate state programs from a legislative standpoint, less frequent and more open use of budget notes in the Budget Writing Ways and Means Committee, and finally, we made a battery of recommendations on how to deal with excessive partisanship. So I thank you for listening to this, and I hope that we can continue our discussion under questions and answers. It's really always nice when the audience doesn't finish before the speaker. Do I just take it from here?
No, you can answer questions.
Okay.
Okay?
Right.
Good. Okay, before we take questions from our audience, our first question will be asked by board host Sue Thomas. Sue is a member of the City Club Board of Governors. She, as you probably remember, led the famous study and report on Portland Development Commission. Sue is co-founder of Avatar, which is an organizational consulting firm. Sue.
Thank you, Susan. Gary, as you're aware, City Club has two studies that are very close to completion, we hope, related to the Oregon Legislature. One of them is the Initiative and Referendum Study, and the other is on partisanship in the Oregon Legislature. Both committees have very much appreciated and learned a lot from the PCOL over the last year as they have engaged together in their various processes. As research advisor to the Partisanship Committee, what I'm interested in hearing you talk about is that the Commission described partisanship as one of the 7 major problems affecting the Oregon Legislature. And I'd like to know, although you didn't specifically rank those 7 problems, how does partisanship play in that mix?
Well, excessive partisanship is a perception. And I agree with the fact that perception is generally reality, or becomes reality if it's not at the outset. So excessive partisanship was a problem. Now, how much of a problem it is and where it ranks, I cannot tell you because everybody has their own opinion about that. We heard from lots of people who just thought we were absolutely dysfunctional because of partisanship. And my first response to anybody that comes and criticizes the legislature for being too partisan is, okay, if you're concerned with partisanship, then you define what excessive partisanship is to me, because I don't know what excessive partisanship is. And then once you've made the definition of excessive partisanship, which will probably come down to something like, well, I don't know what it is, but I know it when I see it. And I agree with that. But then I would hit back with the fact that the state capitol building exists for discourse. Now, the discourse can get out of hand sometimes, and can get out of hand from a partisan political standpoint. But you do not go to the state capitol building expecting that you're never going to have an argument with anybody, because that isn't what it's there for. You know, you have people representing different districts, different geography, different points of view from all over the state. When they get there, they're going to fight. And by fight, I mean politically fight. I don't mean physically fight. And it's going to happen there. It always has, and it always will. And so it's a question of how that is controlled in the capital environment, and ultimately how the people who are arguing and debating and so forth ultimately get together to do the right thing. that is, coalesce to deal with the issue, whatever it might be, and come up with a solution that can garner a majority vote in both the House and the Senate. And that is when you get into a bipartisan arrangement, never a nonpartisan arrangement. I would never advocate nor support a nonpartisan environment in the Capitol building, but I certainly do support, and I believe that the Commission wanted to encourage a bipartisan structure. But in a bipartisan structure, you're going to have disagreement. And probably the third point that I would make is, why don't the folks who are so terribly concerned about excessive partisanship, why don't they ask the question of the media, and why the media dwells as much as they do on every little partisan fight that does come up in the legislature, as opposed to dwelling more on the constructive bipartisan things that the legislature has done and will continue to do throughout its history. That's the best response I can give.
Chris Smith, City Club member. I have a fondness for the legislature because I like deliberative policymaking. At the very beginning of your remarks, you touched on the initiative as a threat to the legislature. You didn't relate any recommendations around that. The concern, of course, is that with the relatively easy access to the ballot for the initiative, you then have a policymaking environment that's about sound bites rather than deliberation. So does the Commission have any remedies for that problem?
Well, you know, we had a little discussion before we started today about the initiative process and the recommendations that the Commission made. And although I'd like to pretend to be absolutely 100% aware of everything that the Commission did in its recommendations, I can't quote it from memory, but I can read it to you, and so I'm going to. The initiative reform recommendations follow, and I think they made a lot of sense. The only time that I was exposed to them was when the committee brought them to the Commission, and the Commission, I believe, unanimously adopted them. I don't believe that there was any dissenting votes on this, but, and I think they will make some sense to you, and this is keeping in mind that whenever you run the initiative reform issue up the flagpole, you immediately have armies descending on you. And so I think that these recommendations probably can keep the peace and get the support of the armies. We said we should require citizen initiative and referendum chief petitioners to be registered voters in Oregon. What's wrong with that? We should require that for each member a statement appear in the voter's pamphlet that lists the number of signatures gathered in each of Oregon's 36 counties, what percentage of the signatures gathered are from each county, and what percentage of eligible voters in each county signed the petition. We suggested that we require a notarized statement indicating that the identities and physical addresses of the top 5 contributors to a ballot measure signature gathering effort be disclosed in the Oregon voters pamphlet. We recommended that the Secretary of State publicize and explain for the process, explain the process for filing complaints about the initiative process, and then insist that existing penalties for voters pamphlet and other violations be imposed. We recommended establishing a regular process for considering and possibly taking legislative action on legislative proposals. This is one of the chief positive arguments for the annual session in 2008. By February of 2008, we will all have a pretty good idea of what's going on in the initiative world. If it's an emergency matter, if it's something that the legislature needs to attend to, they would have the opportunity to deal with that during that special session in February, thus potentially removing the need for any further consideration of an initiative. We recommended establishing a process for providing timely advisory opinions on whether initiative proposals meet their eligibility requirements, and finally conduct a rigorous review of fraudulent or other irregular means to gather signatures, and then clarify the remedies for the violations. Those are the recommendations that came from the Commission on the initiative process, and I think they're all good, personally.
Roger Smith, City Club member. No, I'm not related to Chris. Excuse me. You have talked about, both the commission and today, Gary, you talked about the fact that the commission wanted to keep all these recommendations together as a whole package. Do you see the new rules as proposed by Speaker Merkley to take out some of the guts of the proposal so they can break it up into pieces?
Probably yes. We on the commission know that we're not going to get 100% of this adopted. As a matter of fact, there's 2 or 3 in here that I would just quietly not support myself. But as one of the co-chairs, I support the package. I will advocate for the package, and that's with full knowledge that the legislature is the ultimate arbiter of all of this. They're going to make the decision. And I believe that, the leadership has been very receptive to the recommendations that we've made. But there are questions, there are concerns. Some of these recommendations require huge steps by the legislature, huge departure from the tradition. And I would expect that since it's a new party in power in the House and a new set of leadership in the House, that they're going to be timid on some of these items, and I can understand why. I'm not being critical, and that therefore you're going to probably take up some of them a little bit later. They're not going to do them all right now, but the fact that they are taking up the discussion on retiming, annual sessions, a number of the ethics and campaign finance reform items, and a number of other things that are in here that aren't getting a lot of publicity, I think it's a good sign. I feel good about it, and I'll be complimentary of the leadership if they continue down the path that they're going down now and the way that they're receiving and deliberating on these recommendations.
Leslie Moorhead, City Club member, and I'm the research advisor for the Initiative and Referendum Committee. So I will bring the questioning back around a little bit to initiative and referendum efforts. Based on your last question, in terms of keeping these recommendations all together as a package, I wonder what the practicality is of the final implementation of all of the parts and pieces. So would you go through your general outline of how many parts or how many pieces of the whole package are simply legislative rule changes? How many are laws that the legislature would likely pass without too much controversy in terms of the public accepting them? What things the legislature might want to refer to the people, and then what might also, as you referred to before, be constitutional changes?
That's a big question, and I really can't answer it very well. I believe that way better than half of our recommendations can be done simply by a signature of the presiding officers or by a rules change in the House and in the Senate or by action of the Legislative Administration Committee. I don't believe that most of the recommendations that we made, probably well above half, need a bill for an act or a constitutional amendment. When we started out our deliberations in the commission, we made a conscious choice to stay away from constitutional amendments insofar as we could, and we managed to stay away from them, period. Even with the annual session piece, and that's one of the reasons the annual session piece is try it, see if you like it. If Oregonians accept it and the legislature likes it, then the legislature can come back with a proposed constitutional amendment. Because going out with a constitutional amendment, it would have become immediately controversial. There would have been people on the pro side and the con side, and we might have lost it. And if we lost it, it would have been dead for years, a decade probably. But we didn't want to do that. We wanted to give it a try because if you've watched what's gone on in elections in the state in the last 20 years, you know that annual sessions, for example, has been on the ballot in the past, and there was literally no campaign for it or against it. It almost passed. We heard in the legislature from a lot of folks, pro and con. It was very clear that there wasn't this was not a lopsided issue. There was a lot of interest, but a lack of understanding about this issue. So we thought it was a lot fairer to give it the try the way we did through the rules than to pass a constitutional amendment up front. Having said that, we introduced, I think, 11 bills that do contain things that need to be done in order to accommodate our recommendations, not the least of which is the renovation of the Public Compensation Commission. That needs to be changed by law in order to do what we suggested that it do. And there were some other items throughout our recommendations that will require some technical legislative change. I don't know that any of the bills are going to necessarily be hot button items during the process, except for the appropriations bills. The appropriation bill, if the renovation of the Capitol project moves forward as far as we would like to see it move, at least with the wings, we're talking about an appropriation bill that will eat up probably $30+ million early on, and that's going to be controversial. And the other items that we have proposed that require the expenditure of funds, additional staff, better pay for legislators and so forth, will all require that a budget bill, appropriations bill, ultimately be passed, and those will be controversial because there are some legislators who would rather spend that money on something else, like public schools or state police or whatever. And so we're all in competition for this money together. And if I can just put in a plug for the wings renovation, it's easy to vote no on an appropriation bill that spends $38 million that's going to make posh offices for you when you're a legislator. It's easy to vote no on that. How are you going to vote 2 years from now when it's 50? Or 2 years after that when it's 75? Because when we first started this thing, I was a staffer. It was only 4 years ago. It was 18. Now, pretty soon, you got to look at it as a business decision. And you cannot avoid fixing the pipes, rewiring the place, taking care of the decay, taking care of the security problems. You cannot ignore that forever. You don't do it in your own home. They don't do it in this hotel building. We don't do it in other public buildings. But we do it in the Capitol building because legislators are timid about voting yes because they know that they're going to get criticized for building themselves posh offices. And they're not their offices. They're your offices. You know, they come and go. But anyway, it's an emotional issue. It's going to require the expenditure of a lot of money. It's going to be a tough vote, and hopefully we can get the support to get it done because the price will only go up. It will not come down. So that's an example of a controversial bill that we're going to have. But once again, I don't think that the majority of these things are going to end up being huge yes-no issues on legislation.
My name is Ray Guggenheim, and I'm a member of the City Club. I was wondering whether the Commission made any recommendations to limit the excessive influence of lobbyists.
No.
Why not?
Well, we probably were able to defer that to the Oregon Law Commission and others. I don't know that we ever really felt that was necessarily one of our primary challenges. Criticism of lobbyists. Now, I was a registered lobbyist for 17 years, so I also defend the lobby. But the criticism of the lobby, once again, is kind of in the eye of the beholder. There is not a person sitting in this room that's not represented by a lobbyist. Whether you know it or not, I don't know. But every one of you are represented. I mean, churches are represented by lobbyists, civic groups, cities, counties, schools. Everybody around here is represented by a lobbyist under the Oregon law. And, you know, I suppose your criticism of lobbyists is all the undue influence they have by taking people off on trips to Hawaii and so on, which is such a minor item. I mean, it doesn't happen that often, and I don't know that it influences anybody's vote or not. I'm not going to put myself in their shoes. It sure as hell would never have influenced mine, but I never got to go on any trips like that. So, but anyway, I think that the excessive influence of the lobby issue is way overplayed. Once again, I think the media needs to take a deep breath and kind of maybe report the other side. Lobbyists, for the most part, are very honest, forthright people, and the legislature would have a tough time functioning if you didn't have information providers like lobbyists there to provide information to them. By the way, when you say lobbyist, it includes a whole lot of public employees who represent their entities, their agencies in state government, their city, their county, and so forth. You know, there are lobbyists of all ilks and types and come from all different groups and organizations. And so you've got to be really, really specific when you start zeroing in on the lobby. I'm sorry that I'm editorializing, and if you want to talk to me about the lobbyists later, well, we can talk, but I can't myself think of what I'd like to do to regulate the lobby from a public commission on the legislature standpoint, and we didn't really go there.
Hello, Gary. Bob McCarthy, City Club member. As an advisor to the Partisanship Committee, I want to take you back to that topic. It seems to me from the recommendations of the Commission, you have made significant recommendations to strengthen the legislature and its internal functioning. Aside from the recommendation for open primaries, it's unclear to me how your recommendations get at what most would argue is the most significant issue undermining public trust in the legislature, which is excessive partisanship. And that is partisanship of the most destructive kind, that I would define as fighting on behalf of one's party or for personal power, party power, as opposed to fighting on behalf of Oregon and its citizens. So I'd like to know if, in your judgment of the Commission's work, if those recommendations of yours touch on this issue.
You will have to wait to see if the recommendations that we made that are implemented deal with your concerns over excessive partisanship. Obviously, you have concerns over excessive partisanship that are not shared by myself or other members of the Commission. There are some members of the Commission that definitely do share your concern, but I don't know that a majority of the members did. And I'm not going to argue with you because as we said before, it's a personal opinion as to how bad you think excessive partisanship is. I made the statement in one of the Commission meetings, and it's probably the third time I had my head handed to me, when I said, the best way to deal with excessive partisanship is just to invoke the golden rule. And I'm serious about that, dead serious about it. People get elected to go to the legislature and serve. Most of them serve well and conduct themselves well. Some people go there and are jerks. And I don't know that you're ever I mean, you elected them. I don't know that we're ever going to be able to correct that. But they are the distinct minority. And I won't criticize a legislator for being partisan. I don't know when they cross the line to being excessively partisan. But if they are, in fact, ignoring the needs of the people of Oregon and not doing what's right for the state of Oregon because they are locked into some partisan objective, then that's wrong. But I believe that you would find that both parties believe that their objectives are in the best interest of the state of Oregon. And thus, since a majority rules, you have to live with the outcome. I don't have a good answer for you other than stay tuned, because I do believe that the pendulum is starting to swing back the other way. I think that we've peaked and it's starting to go back the other way.
I'm sorry to say that we are out of time. I'd like to thank our members and guests for your participation here today, our radio and television audience for your interest in City Club, and let's all thank Gary Wilhelms for a most candid and exhilarating discussion. We are adjourned.